So, continuing on to part two. So, back during Atlantean times, during the time of Sumer, which was out in the region of Mesopotamia, and the Anunnaki, the so-called gods, the way that the whole history of the inversion in what we now read about, hear about, intuit, and see evidence of reflects the same sort of fracture that occurred during Atlantis. The original teachings, the early pre Sumerian priests, and that the cultures, the scientists, the pre scientist cultures, which are sometimes referred to as the Lyran Syrian Aramatena lineages, they taught of a direct connection to source. They taught of crystal and grid technologies and living in harmony with cosmic law. Unfortunately, there was a distortion phase, and that was what birthed the rise of the Anunnaki pantheon, which has been presented in the Old Testaments to form the basis for the three major world religions, which are really talking about a race of beings. However, the way that history has become distorted down through time, this introduced hierarchical gods which were really beings. Jehovah means it's a title. It's a title of essentially a king or a ruler. It is not the creator God. However, people get lost in the details, especially when they've been taught a certain thematic story for ages, for generations. And these hierarchical gods demanded worship and control. And they were all about genetic modification. And they enforced the idea of divine rulership through bloodline. This is kingship. This is where the concept of bloodline families wanting to control and feeling that they alone are worthy of knowing, having access to this knowledge and being able to rule the world over all of their perceived so-called lesser beings. Um, the whole system, the original source connected philosophy was distorted when the original creator being archetypes were co-opted. And so entire creation myths were rewritten in their image. The story of Enki and Enlil, this has created a distortion that has been passed down in written texts for so many years. And that's actually a part of the reason why the original guardian races insisted upon oral tradition. They did not want things written down. Egypt and the priesthood of Amun, this was a fragmentation of the Ra teachings. In the pre-dynastic Kem, which is ancient Egypt, the Ra lineage and the temples of Dendera, Edfu, and Abydos preserve star knowledge and advanced DNA activation practices, as well as, again, direct communion with the divine through your inner sun. Now, it became distorted into a worship of a sun god, an external being. And so the rise of the Amun priesthood, this was around 1500 BCE, this corrupted the sacred teachings of Ra, and it shifted communion to this whole entire ritual using intermediaries and outside of the self. The original solar logos teachings, solar logos relate back to the original Aryan peoples and their sacred symbol of the swastika, as well as the Basque people and their Laburu symbol, which was also a solar logos. This was corrupted and it was fragmented. Ra was turned into a wrathful deity, and the the pharaonic bloodlines were hybridized in order to support a control matrix. It was all about controlling and making things exclusive. The Christic teachings and the early Gnostics, these were co-opted by the Roman Empire. The original teaching of Yeshua was all about a non-dual, direct relationship with the divine, about inner resurrection, about sacred union, eros gamos, with the creation forces, which are masculine and feminine, electric and magnetic, and also all about multidimensional liberation. The distortion phase that strongly took over and rooted occurred with the Council of Nicaea. And that was different reports between 325 and 328 AD. And this was what formalized Roman Christianity by removing reincarnation, the divine feminine, and the Gnostic elements, which were all about self-empowerment and sovereignty. The church created a savior-based model and replaced self-initiation with dogma, with guilt, with obedience to hierarchy. And this was very effective in inverting Christ consciousness into a control grid. The Hermeticism and the Renaissance magic revival came later. Originally, Hermeticism contained pure alchemical truths. Again, these truths were rooted in ancient knowledge and connection to sacred wisdom, sacred geometry, the teachings of the one mind, and the balance of opposites. However, the influx of Kabbalistic or Klipotic magic, which was really brought forth into the consciousness egregores of the time, with Crowley and the Crowleyan and Thelema during the 1800s and the 1900s. And this really introduced the left-hand path through reinterpretation. The Enochian sigil magic and sorcery was focused on this Hermetic revival, but it was actually distorted. By reviving sacred alchemy language, however, bringing in and embedding dark polarity manipulation, these teachings and this movement seduce seekers of truth into consensual energetic slavery through the door of seeking higher knowledge. Theosophy and the Ascended Master inversion. So the original teaching, such as the ancient Himalayan orders linked to the connection to Bon, and Bon was also linked to genuine Agartha and Solar Logos teachings. Remember, these were the peoples that wanted to preserve that sacred knowledge from the past, which taught all about spiritual science and planetary stewardship. Well, when this is Madame Helena Blavatsky, when her theosophy came online at the end of the 1800s, she was reintroducing some of these cosmic principles. That was when Rudolf Steiner was a part of it. However, her movement was infiltrated by Jesuit and British intelligence assets, and they brought in Luciferian distortions and promoted the whole ascended master hierarchy. This is connected to the distortion of purity of so-called race, the master race programming, which we saw as the choice of Hitler and the Nazis when he bought into what Crowley was selling and completely rejected Steiner's philosophy. And that really, we have seen that becoming more and more infiltrated into our Western society, even today. It gradually took root and it spread. Now, just as a side note, Hitler actually targeted Rudolf Steiner and he fled to Switzerland where he died. So Crowley and Steiner definitely viewed each other as the other. The 1960s and the 70s, that was the Kundalini awakening. And true Kundalini awakening is a full spectrum DNA and light body restoration that is governed by the higher self and is overseen by cosmic intelligence that's aligned to source. It is a path that is, if properly done, through a series of steps, through purification of the physical body, through doing the inner work, through shadow work, through releasing any blocked and stored traumas, and to purifying the physical vessel to a point of where this organic activation occurs naturally. However, the psychedelic and guru-based movements, which we are all familiar with because we're still kind of in that time frame. For instance, Rajneesh, this is someone who was part of this earlier time frame, and they encouraged ungrounded, unfiltered spiritual opening, but without a focus on developing your higher discernment or protection. And so this allowed service to self consciousnesses, whatever you call them. Steiner referred to them as archonic entities. This is the entity hijacking that has occurred and affected people through drug use, through trauma induced awakenings, and unshielded chakra openings. And this opens the door to false light channeling and fragmentation of the auric field. And this is actually what happened to Aleister Crowley, because he was opening up his consciousness field. And when you open that door, you don't know what's going to come in. True service to others, truly authentic, benevolent, higher consciousness beings will never, never attempt to come in to the body, to come into the astral body. That is why the whole concept of channeling, in the way that it was originally understood, was when you physically give up control of your body and you allow an outside consciousness to inhabit it, to speak through you. No truly benevolent being will do that, because that harms the vessel. And so just keep that in mind. So now we are in this time frame. Disclosure, 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 disclosure. Everyone hears that. There's so much galactic remembrance. There's all of this connections with ETs. Galactic remembrance is a natural stage of human evolution, and it does involve reconnecting to our multidimensional star family. You know, we think about the Lyran, Sirian, Pleiadian, Elohai lineages, Andromeda as well. So this is something that, yes, we can expect to be part of our awakening. However, much of what we hear of, much of what's being experienced to this day, and actually even more so during this time, it's ramping up, has been a mass infiltration of false ET collectives. Ashtar Command, the Galactic Federation of Light, channeled Taigetan groups, and many, many others. Be wary. This is not organic. And by blending real cosmic truths with deception, these groups are presenting savior narratives, galactic hierarchies, and DNA tampering agendas under the guise of ascension support. And in many cases, they are not just coming through randomly. They are being assisted by the technology that we here on Earth have, that many people are not aware of, but which nevertheless are actively being used. We will go into that a little further. And so now we're just going to talk a little bit about the timeline, and there will probably be some groups that you recognize. So who came up with the the term New Age? Well, the term New Age in the modern sense, which originally was referred to as a coming spiritual era, it began to really show up prominently in the theosophical and esoteric literature of the late 19th and early 20th century. And Alice Bailey, born in 1880, she lived until the mid 1940s, late 1940s, and she was the founder of the Lucis Trust. She was the first one to formalize the term New Age and to use that term extensively, which was then, of course, picked up. And Lucis Trust was originally called Lucifer Publishing. She claimed to be channeling a being called Jawal Kul, a so-called ascended master. And she's the one that framed the New Age as the Age of Aquarius. And she associated it with the emergence of a one world religion, a global governance, and an externalization of the hierarchy. Do any of those terms sound familiar? One world order, new world order, one world government, one world currency, etc. It was phrased and couched in the lovely visual of the physical return of the spiritual government on earth. And this is the framework that actually became the spiritual bedrock for the UN's vision of a planetary culture blending pseudo-spirituality with centralized control. And so can you see how the service to self consciousness, which is all about hive mind, hierarchical controls, and conformity and groupthink, would appeal, would find ways to use this sort of a movement and actually reach people that would otherwise never even give any of their concept a second thought. So while the term New Age was used earlier in esoteric circles, Alice Bailey, specifically her work from the 1920s to the 1940s, most strongly defined all of the ideology that we can see right now as the war on spirituality today. And so these are just some of the actual timelines for these folks. Helena Blavatsky, 1875. Okay. And during that time, Steiner was with her. So Steiner was actually part of the original formation. And Annie Besant, she was the one who, she's really credited with beginning that fracture in philosophy that pushed Steiner away. And she is credited also with opening the door to some of these influences that have political connections. Guy and Edna Ballard, they are the orchestrators of the I Am movement, which is definitely considered one of the distorted teachings, but it pulled in a whole lot of people. Alice Bailey and Lucis Trust. Guy Ballard was another, was part of that original I Am, and he continued to put out, some work that's heavily referenced in the New Age movement. Elizabeth Clare Prophet, the 9 channelings, the Seth material, A Course in Miracles, all of these things contain distortions. Now, all of this, every part of the New Age movement was not distorted. Steiner's work, because he was very much connected to the original sovereign Christos sovereignty recognition, definitely not. And again, I say, look at the fruits. The law of one. So in the early 1980s, the law of one is referenced as being very solidly grounded in the original sovereign Christos consciousness philosophy. And so that's very high consciousness. And then we have others that have since brought out a lot of inverted teachings. Drunvalo Melchizedek. So he is responsible for teaching an inversion of the Merkaba, which is basically it reverses the correct spin. And that is a huge problem because that does not contribute to people's repair of DNA or ascending their consciousness. It does the opposite over time. He also began teaching what he called the flower of life, which is a distorted sacred geometry. Nowadays, people have recognized that picture, that symbol, is actually the daisy of death. It is not the flower of universal life, which is 12 sphere. Anything which is 10 sphere is source disconnected, and so therefore it is descension. It is not ascension. So anyways, here's a few more. So you can just refer back to this if you're interested in more of these figures that are going to be probably familiar. So some of the primary themes of the New Age distortions, the Merkaba distortion is a huge one. A manipulation of the rays of creation. The Metatron, all of these things are referred to as the Metatronic inversions. And it really talks about a whole entire system of distortions and false matrices that came to us since the fallen angelics and the fallen races from Atlantis moved into such polarity away from the original Christos intentions. The Metatronic tree of life, which is the 10 sphere, today's Kabbalah, you can see that it's distorted. It is missing 2 spheres to make it aligned. There are so many signs that if you pay attention to what your consciousness is pointing out, you will actually recognize as there being something wrong with it. The tribe of Dan lineage manipulations, that's something that I'll go a little bit more in detail into a little further in. The false violet flame, which actually is an inversion of the 7D flame. The hexagram, which is kind of like it's a flat paper use of the Merkaba. And the Merkaba is not a flat theme. It's a visual that needs to become fully embodied in order to use it properly. And so this teaching that this is sufficient is really incomplete. The Ashtar Command and the Galactic Federation stories are distortions. The false third eye activations that are linked to Metatronic implants, this helps to give these lower fourth dimensional consciousness entities access to people, and people think that they are actually, speaking to Jesus and other so-called ascended masters. The Fibonacci spiral, as opposed to the crystal spiral. This can be proven just by looking at math. Now, the quadrivium teaches us. The quadrivium is actually a system, and this is something that Rudolf Steiner taught to the children in the Waldorf schools. The quadrivium, that teaches pretty much an understanding of creation in this universe. It is astronomy, it is music, it is mathematics, it is geometry. And so all things in creation can be validated by an understanding of the principles of the quadrivium. But the problem is that so many people do not want to go digging into that. And at this time, there are a great many core distortions in mainstream utilization of these sacred teachings. The cold, false white light is something that I think many people are familiar with. And this is all about a deceptive pure light that's actually cold, artificial, and disempowering. And this is rooted in the Metatronic tree of life and the synthetic grid systems. And it disconnects us from our inner Christos power and the warm, eternal flame codes. And what I have heard, the way to recognize this is the difference between feeling the warmth within your central channel and in your, especially your solar plexus chakra, but also in your heart center, and being captivated and fascinated by a feeling of euphoria, which is really it's focused on the upper chakras. There needs to be a balance of both, and that warmth needs to be there. If it is only in your head and your mind, then that is what Steiner described as Luciferian, and it's unbalanced. This is part of the cold false white light. The other thing is the going into that light tunnel at death of the physical body, which is actually a soul harvesting trap that recycles. Glamorizing light without wisdom and bypassing the sacred darkness, which is actually the feminine great womb of creation. False ascension portals and ungrounded channeled bliss states. Again, that goes back to that. Gate walking through true embodied wisdom through superficial light worker branding. There's so much of that. If someone says the word light worker, people automatically think, oh, you're one of us. You have to dig a little deeper than that. So the hexagram, the inverted Merkaba, this is Drunvalo. And, you have to look at everything through a lens of, well, I don't necessarily think that people have the intention. I myself was not aware of the colors properly. And so when I've been doing a lot of work with my Merkaba, I was not aware that the blue feminine channel and the gold masculine channel were actually inverted. The original proper Merkaba channels, the masculine is the blue and the feminine is the gold. And so that was an inversion that I myself was practicing. And, it's because I did not have that discernment, which required me to dig even deeper than I already had been digging to really get to the core and then to test it myself. And yes, there is a huge difference in doing the work and activating the Merkaba with the masculine pyramid first as a blue flame, basically the blue flame color, and secondarily bringing in the feminine gold magnetic pyramid. There's a huge difference in that work than in doing it in the reverse. And so I myself did not know any better. So I give Drunvalo, absolutely, I give him grace. I never felt that he had any bad intentions, but that he was just basically receiving this information channeled and through experiential that wasn't actually grounded in looking at through physical research and doing deep work, digging into, the knowledge. The six-pointed star hexagram, this here too, this reflects a not, this is a partial of sacred geometry. This is not the flower of eternal life. This is essentially a Metatronic inversion. So generally speaking, that six-pointed star, the hexagram on paper, which is a widely used symbol of spiritual balance, in many cases, it represents an inverted Metatronic Merkaba, and it mirrors the false light structure of opposing polarities locked in to a static geometric form. It's a two-dimensional seal rather than the living star tetrahedron. Okay,